Amen. My goodness. We are most definitely living in trying times today. Trying times. The coronavirus has radically altered our world. There are now over 300,000 people infected worldwide, nearly 27,000 cases in the United States alone. Over 13,000 people have died globally, and it has claimed over 350 American lives. The world is suffering, the world is grieving, the world is sick and scared. We are sequestered in our homes, trying to save our own lives and the lives of our neighbors. The market has receded before in our lifetime. In 2008, we've been afraid before, like after 9/11. Food has been rationed before, like during World War II, but never like this. Never have so many businesses, restaurants, and churches closed. Never before have so many people been put out of work. Never before have we been forced into social isolation. We are living in the midst of an unprecedented moment. Maybe the most unprecedented in 100 years. It's a time of great uncertainty and fear. The long-term impact of this virus is yet unknown. And our hearts, while they break for people suffering around the world, we know everyone is in need of hope and healing. Research says that when bad things happen and suffering occurs, human beings universally look for someone or something to blame. I don't know if you've noticed, but so far in this crisis, it seems like everyone is playing the blame game. Americans are blaming China for not taking the steps they should have taken to stop the outbreak of the virus. China is blaming the U.S. for starting the outbreak. Many Americans, including the president, have been referring to this virus as the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, the Asian virus, or even the foreign virus, placing blame on Asian people, fanning the flames of xenophobia and racism, leading to an outbreak of anti-Asian coronavirus rhetoric and hate crimes. The Anti-Defamation League has noted a surge in anti-Asian activities, including racist messages or caricatures of Chinese people, mocking their eating habits, accents, and hygiene. Beyond humans, some are even blaming animals, like bats or pangolins, for the virus. I didn't even know what a pangolin was before this virus. Many Americans also are joining in the blame game, blaming the spread of coronavirus on the president or the slow government response. I've seen older folks blaming millennials for not taking the virus seriously, and I've seen younger folks blaming their boomer parents and grandparents for not staying at home either and taking it seriously. Everyone is blaming Generation Z for going on spring break and naively saying, if I get corona, I get corona. It won't stop me from partying. The only thing we can all agree on right now is that there is someone to blame for the coronavirus, and it is not us. That's a dangerous thing about the blame game. When someone else is to blame, it means no one takes responsibility. There's a Persian poet who once wrote, as human beings, we can't accept that everything happens to us is our own doing. We need someone to thank and someone to blame, so we created the concept of God and the devil. A recent research study by Psychology Today suggests that when people are the victims of disease, they search for someone to blame for their misfortunes, and often that search to explain suffering leads people to blame God. We see this in the most detestable form in so-called religious leaders who blame God for the outbreak of the coronavirus. Roberto de Mattei called the coronavirus the killer of globalization and the scourge from God, and he reminded his followers that God sends tribulations to families and cities and nations for the sins that they commit. Robert Jeffress, pastor of First Baptist Dallas, Texas, preached a sermon entitled, "Is the Coronavirus a Judgment from God?" And he claimed all natural disasters can be traced ultimately to sin. The ridiculous view of these so-called religious leaders, the view that sin is the explanation for all suffering, is as old as the Bible itself. And yet it should have been put to rest long ago when Jesus rejected the idea point blank. In Luke 13, Jesus said, "Do you think that because some Galileans suffered in this way, they were worse sinners than other Galileans, or the 18 who died in the Tower of Siloam when it fell? Do you think they were worse sinners than others living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you," Jesus said, "but unless you repent, you will all perish like they did." Jesus is clear. There is no cause and effect relationship between sin and suffering. The passage we heard read today from the Gospel of John confirms Jesus' rejection of this bad theology. Jesus saw a man who was blind from birth, but his disciples wanted to play the blame game, and they asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents?" Jesus rejected their assumption outright and said, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so the work of God might be revealed in him and through him." Jesus dismissed the possibility that sin could be the cause of the man's suffering. No one was to blame for the suffering, not the man or his parents or even God. Jesus reduced suffering to a morally neutral fact of human existence. Suffering just is. It cannot be explained by sin, and it is not caused by God. However, Jesus said God can work through suffering to bring injustice into the light and to create change and transformation, new birth and new creation. Suffering breaks God's heart. God has a preferential love for those who suffer, which is why God draws near to the suffering in order to embrace those who suffer with love and comfort and peace. In 1947, Albert Camus published The Plague, a story about a virus that spreads uncontrollably from animals to humans and ends up destroying half of the population of an ordinary town called Oran on the Algerian coast. The book is eerily similar to our current moment. As the book opens, an air of normality reigns across the land. The town's inhabitants lead busy, money-centered lives. And then, with the pace of a thriller, the horror begins. An epidemic seizes the town, transmitting itself from citizen to citizen, spreading panic in the streets. And to write this book, Camus immersed himself in studying the history of plagues. He read about the Black Death that killed 50 million in Europe in the 14th century, and the Italian plague in 1630 that killed 280,000 across the plains, and the Great Plague of London in 1665, as well as the plagues that ravaged China's eastern seaboard during the 18th and the 19th centuries. And Camus was drawn to this theme because he had this belief that plagues were concentrations of a universal precondition that human beings have, that all of us, all humanity, is vulnerable to being randomly exterminated at any moment by a virus or an accident or the actions of our fellow human beings. Now, in his story, the people of Iran can't accept this fact. Even when a quarter of the city is dying, they keep imagining reasons that it won't happen to them. They're good modern people with phones and airplanes and newspapers. Surely they're not going to die like the wretches of the 17th century in London or the 18th century in Canton. One character even says, it's impossible it should be the plague. Everyone knows it has vanished from the West. Yes, everyone knew that, Camus added, except the dead. At the height of the contagion, 500 people a week are dying, and a Catholic priest gives a callous sermon explaining that the plague is God's punishment for the depravity of the people. But a doctor named Rue knows better. He's watched too many children die already. And he says suffering makes no sense. It is random, it is absurd, and that is the kindest thing that one can say about it. Philosopher Alain de Botton explains that for Camus there is no escape from our frailty. Being alive will always remain an emergency. It is truly an inescapable underlying precondition of our existence. Plague or no plague, we are always susceptible to sudden death, an event that can render our lives instantaneously meaningless. Camus called this the absurdity of life, but he believed that recognizing absurdity should not lead us into despair, but redemption, a softening of the heart, a turning away from judgment and moralizing, turning toward joy and gratitude. He said, therefore, we need to love our fellow human beings and work diligently for the amelioration of suffering. Disciples were not the only ones who played the blame game in John 9. The Pharisees got in on the game themselves. They assumed that the man born blind was a sinner, and they even went further to proclaim that he could not have been healed by Jesus because Jesus was a sinner as well. When it comes to sin and suffering, we have this deep and powerful human desire to find a scapegoat. We'll scapegoat anything we can. We scapegoat presidents and political parties for our problems. We have, throughout history, scapegoated the Jews and Muslims, immigrants and minorities, transgender and LGBTQ people, the poor especially, always the scapegoat for our sufferings. And whenever humans play the blame game, it almost always has violent and disastrous consequences. As we move through this season of Lent, which now feels like it may be the longest Lent in history, the day and the hour are coming when we will remember how everyone made Jesus the scapegoat for their sins. The disciples and the Pharisees, the Sadducees and the chief priests and the scribes, the Sanhedrin and Herod and Pilate, the Roman soldiers, all the people of Jerusalem and the crowds, they placed the blame on Jesus so they would not have to face their own responsibility. They accused him of blasphemy and treason and condemned him to die on a cross between two revolutionaries. Camus called mortality our pre-existing condition. Augustine referred to this same phenomenon as our original sin. But I think our true pre-existing condition is our propensity to play the blame game. Our human proclivity to deny our sin, to deflect our guilt, and to project our blame on someone else. This human predisposition is as old as Adam. You know, that first human, you might remember from the great primordial myth, didn't just eat the forbidden fruit, but wouldn't take responsibility for it when God came calling. He placed the blame on Eve. And then Eve placed the blame on the serpent. And the serpent placed the blame on God. Everyone blamed someone else until there was no one left to blame. That's the story of the Bible and all of human history, the story of people blaming someone else for their sufferings. But in John 9, Jesus looked at the disciples and the Pharisees and asked them a haunting question about the problem of suffering. What would happen if there was no one to blame? What would you say and what would you do if there was nothing else and no one else to blame? This is a question we need to ask ourselves in the midst of the coronavirus. What would we say and do if there was no one to blame? The question reminds me of one of the greatest lessons about leadership that I learned from reading Todd Bolsinger, who said, "The leader in the organization is not always the person at the top, it's the person who's not blaming anyone." It's a very humbling idea. It's why Jesus was a true leader. He never blamed anyone for what he suffered or experienced. In fact, he strived to help his followers to stop playing the blame game, to stop scapegoating people like the poor and the sick and the marginalized, the Samaritans and the Gentiles, the tax collectors and the prostitutes. He taught us that talking about people's sins and trying to explain suffering is a purely academic exercise and a waste of time. The Pharisees and the Sadducees loved to debate about who was a sinner and why someone was suffering. It was a distraction from the work that they should have been doing. Instead of trying to explain the cause of suffering, they should have been doing everything they could to relieve people's suffering. Because that is the work of God, the work that Jesus talked about in John 9, the work that we have all been called to do. When Jesus told his disciples, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, he was born blind so God's works might be revealed in him," he was saying that our work as human beings is to care for the sick and the disabled. That is why he followed that statement by saying, "We must work to do the works of the one who sent me while it is day. Night is coming. A time is coming when no one can work. But as long as I am in the world, I will be the light of the world." Jesus was commanding his disciples to stop playing this theological blame game and get busy loving and healing people. Stop trying to figure out who sinned and start caring for people who are being oppressed and beaten down by the world. Stop trying to find the cause of suffering and start working to relieve the sufferings of those who are sick and hurting. Stop explaining and blaming and start being the light of the world right now before it's too late. In his famous book, The Rise of Christianity, Rodney Stark argued that the explosive growth of an obscure and marginal movement of apocalyptic Jews in the 2nd and 3rd century to become a community powerful enough to take over the Roman Empire is partially explained by the way the followers of Jesus responded to plagues and diseases. There were many plagues and diseases in those early days of the church, and Stark describes the loving way Christians responded to pandemics throughout history and claims that this is the critical reason a small group of 100 or so followers grew to become a church of 6 million believers by 300 AD. Even Roman politicians noted the way Christians responded to the plagues. Emperor Julian complained bitterly of how the Galileans would care for even non-Christian sick people. The bishops took notice as well. Dionysius, bishop of Alexandria, reported that during the plagues, Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of other people. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ. Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, during a plague said, "This pestilence, which seems horrible and deadly, searches out the justice of each and every one and examines the mind of the human race, whether the healthy care for the sick, whether relatives dutifully love kinsmen as they should, do not desert the afflicted." During the Black Plague, Catherine of Siena ministered to the sick, and the great reformer Martin Luther later said, "We are bound to each other in such a way that no one may forsake the other in this time of distress, but is obliged to assist and help as we would like to be helped." Luther even claimed that the commandment, "Thou shalt not murder," means that we must never endanger others through our negligence or recklessness, which is why in his catechism, Luther encouraged believers to obey quarantine orders, fumigate their houses, take precautions to avoid the spreading of diseases, and stated that the Christian motive for hygiene and sanitation did not arise in self-preservation, but as an ethic of service to our neighbor. Beyond Luther, it was later Christians who created the first hospitals in Europe as hygienic places to provide care for the sick during the time of plague, and understanding that negligence that spread disease was in fact a form of murder. All throughout history, the plagues have caused people of faith to search themselves and to either discover the way of love or the way of blame. Instead of spending all their time arguing theologically about sin or debating the cause of suffering, historically, the truest followers of Jesus have leapt into action on behalf of those who were suffering and cared for those impacted by diseases that plagued their communities. Plagues intensify everything. They have the ability to intensify our everyday lives. They intensify our fear and the desire for self-preservation. They intensify our grief and our anger. They intensify our sense of mortality and frailty. But they can also intensify our love. They can also intensify our sense of our common humanity. They can also intensify relationships. They can also intensify community. They can also intensify the church and its mission. They can also intensify our ability to relieve the suffering of others by giving up on the blame game and getting to work. There's no need to try and explain suffering because there's only one answer to the problem of suffering, and that answer is us. We are the answer to suffering that God has given the world. We are the only hope the world has for healing. And so we have to ask, what will this plague intensify in us? Will the coronavirus intensify our fear and our propensity to blame, or will it intensify our love and our compassion? How will we be remembered in this age of coronavirus? How will the church be remembered? What will this scourge upon our bodies call us to be and to do? Will we play the blame game, or will we be like those brave followers of Jesus who showed us that crisis is a time to roll up our sleeves and get into the action and be the light of the world and care for the suffering and to spread more love than ever before? May the absurdity of this virus lead us not into fear or despair, but soften our hearts. Turn us away from judgment and moralizing, and turn us toward joy and gratitude. May it intensify our love for our fellow human beings and lead each and every one of us to work harder than ever before to relieve the suffering of the world. Amen.